So today, as to set up the day's lectures. So first, before the break, I'll be going over concussion. So definitions, what's happening to the brain, and I think that's always an interesting topic. This is a bit out of order. Signs and symptoms will actually be first, and then the links to long-term pathology. So in the news, they're often talking about NFL players coming forward, even NHL players with this, what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So I'm glad I said that because that's on record now. Or CTE. What is that about, and how does that relate to other neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, which I'll talk a little bit about in this respect, but to set up, well, I'll have a whole lecture on Alzheimer's as we go along. And then the other one that I think is, somewhat related to concussion is stroke. So again, this is something that most of us are aware of. We get told about the signs and symptoms and call 911 if you experience these symptoms. But then I thought what would be interesting more so for today is to get into the brain mechanism. So what's happening in a stroke, and why do you see certain clinical manifestations, different patterns of damage? And then recovery, so what are some of the treatments that are used for recovery? And prevention I'm not going to get into as much because I think, again, we all probably have been, don't smoke, don't drink, all that fun stuff. So that's, preventing stroke, and it's just basic good cardiovascular function that will help prevent strokes. So that'll be part 2 today after the break. So just as a little setup, I do want to talk in terms more of just kind of theoretical ideas about how we investigate damage to the brain. So, concussions are what's classified as an acquired brain injury. Even stroke would be an acquired brain injury. So what happens when your brain goes through this massive amount of shock? So the brain is plastic. So I was at Toys R Us and I bought some silly putty just to kind of demonstrate this, that the brain does, it's not as rubbery as silly putty, but this will come into play as we go along. But the brain does have a considerable amount of plasticity, and it can compensate for damage. So this is good when we experience these acquired brain injuries, but it also, it puts into question about what's happening, and is there ever really recovery from some of these injuries. So the brain can, make different pathways. You can, sort of set up all these different routes where the brain can detour around damage, and then it can look like you're cured, but in fact the brain is really not. It's still in a state of damage. So, but this is, as the disease progresses slowly, the brain has a remarkable capacity for adapting, and this also sets up, I think, the Alzheimer's talk and in fact Parkinson's. So those two diseases that have neurodegenerative components, as they progress slowly, your brain tries to keep up with it, and oftentimes, there are symptomology, there's symptoms in the brain, there's pathology. That's essentially what Parkinson's disease is or what Alzheimer's disease is, but we don't have any symptoms. So the brain is going through all these changes, and then all of a sudden it seems that it comes out. So compensatory plasticity. So this is the one thing that, again, this sets up a lot of, I guess, all the neurological disorders that we'll be talking about as we move along. But today in terms of stroke and concussion is that brain damage does not always produce behavioral symptoms. So you could have a concussion, but you would not ever even know it. So that's why I would say, how do you know you haven't had a concussion, or how do you know you've had a concussion? And behavioral symptoms are not always linked to obvious neuropathology. And again, this comes into really important play, and I'll touch on this again a bit today in Alzheimer's, that our brains are, sort of can reflect Alzheimer's pathology, but we have no behavioral symptoms. We have no memory loss. We have, none of the dementia that's associated with Alzheimer's. And this is the other thing. So this is really much more applicable to stroke, is that people can change their behavior to adapt to their neural damage. So in stroke in particular, if you're limping your right arm, then you change your behavior and start using your left arm, which is not good, because then the damage that's produced in your brain that causes your right arm to not move is not going around that damaged area, so you're not able to change that through train your brain, I guess, is what we've been talking about in this course. So this is, I just want to briefly touch on as I'm getting into concussion stuff and the more traumatic brain injury, is that people, and I've talked to lots of physicians about this and lots of neurosurgeons and neurologists, is that we can't really see the damage produced by something like a concussion until it's almost too late. And we can't see the damage that's produced by Alzheimer's until it's too late. So it's post-mortem examination that we can really figure out what has happened in the brain and then go back to the living situation and try to understand how that was produced. So this is, so some of you have told me about the see-through brain that's come out, which is kind of interesting. So there's a mouse brain that has particular fluorescent patterns in it that then you can image, have a microscope that sees right through it. So if we can do that in a human to understand some of this, we might be able to overcome this technological resolution. And as technology keeps progressing, we'll probably catch up. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll get to that, but it's the microstructure of the brain, really. So it's the thing that we can't see unless we have a high-power microscope. And so as I go along, hopefully I'll be able to point that out. So what is traumatic brain injury? So it's we'll start here and then we'll go into like more of the concussion stuff. So head injuries are the most common cause of brain damage in people younger than 40. So it's pretty, it's out there, it's pretty relevant. A lot of these are, mainly just due to falls, which probably happens to all of us. We slip on the ice and fall, we hit our head, and that's, that can actually cause a concussion. So, or I guess what a concussion could be also classified as is a mild traumatic brain injury, which always strikes me as a bit funny, because how can you have something that's mild and traumatic at the same time? So I think we need to rethink some of these definitions, and a lot of people will just say anything that causes damage to the brain is a brain injury, and a concussion is one of those. So males more likely to suffer head injuries, and this is 15 to 30, so automobile and motorcycle accidents. So you can just imagine the guy out on his motorcycle who just got his driver's license and flying down the road and gets in an accident. And so a lot of that, sort of reckless behavior almost. So, and this is just, again, looking at incidence rates. So you can see it really drops down. So what's really, I think, fascinating is that 0 to 4, or even actually 0 to about 9, you have a pretty high incidence. So rate per 100,000, anywhere from, in males, you get up to 1,400 head injuries, and then it drops down pretty significantly, but it's still pretty high. And even in females, which is interesting, they made that blue to trick me. So 800 per 100,000. And then it really drops down low. But then once you get back, up into the over 75, it actually swings up again. And it's probably because of either slips and falls on the ice or, any other just instability. So, but it's still, it's falling down, hitting your head, and then that causing some brain injury. So this is actually the age group that some of my research is starting to look at, is that 0 to 9-year-old age group, because there's a lot of the sensitive periods that we talked about during development, those critical periods. These are the times when the brain is really, the cognitive parts of the brain are really turning on, and they're learning how to, they have insight, and it's the age of awareness, I guess, is what my father-in-law always tells me. So it's that time period where if you experience a head injury, what happens then long term? So symptoms and outcomes. So this is more of a traumatic brain injury. So disruption of blood supply. So that would be similar to a stroke, so an ischemic stroke, or induced bleeding. So that would be a hemorrhage. So that's why, again, I think these two topics are somewhat related. Swelling, same thing with a stroke. Your brain tissue can swell, but remember, it's locked in this in the skull, so it has nowhere to go. So as it swells up, it produces pressure, and then that can cause secondary damage. And expose the brain to infection. So one part, I think I may have mentioned in the first lecture, was this blood-brain barrier idea, that blood vessels that come into the brain are actually really tightly controlled. So not everything can slip through into the brain, because if you did get some bacteria into the brain, it would just have a field day, and it would destroy all the tissue. So the blood-brain barrier protects anything from getting into the brain from the blood. And when you have a head injury, oftentimes that blood-brain barrier gets broken and things slip in, so you have secondary damage. And then scar tissue, which is something that's really difficult to control. So unconsciousness. So I would say that most people would say that if you had a head injury or a brain injury or a concussion, you would have unconsciousness, which is absolutely false. So you don't have to experience unconscious loss of consciousness to know that you've had a concussion, and that's something that we'll get into. But obviously the more serious ones are these brief or prolonged comas that can happen in a motorcycle or vehicle accident. This one I'll talk a bit more about in terms of concussion, but the idea is that, or even in a traumatic brain injury, the idea is that as you're going forward, as your velocity is, if you're in a car, you're going forward and you hit something, everything stops. But your brain actually swings forward, hits the front of, let's say if you hit something, like this way, your brain will actually, because it's just jello, it'll fall forward and then fall backwards, or it'll rotate forward, rotate backwards. And that's where you get this idea of the coup, the site of the impact, so right where the brain stops in front of the skull. And you might be able to see this. There's a nice sharp ridge right at the front of the skull. So your brain will hit that, and that will cause some pretty serious damage. But then it bounces back, so the contra coup, and you can also see there's another little ridge. So that gets at the back of your brain. So again, it's that, the frontal part of the brain, which is hitting the first, the ridge, and then the second part bounces back. And that's probably why some people see stars, because that's the visual part of the brain. So as that bounces back, it sets off this, we'll call it the cascade of excitatory processes, turns on all that part of the brain, but it's not being turned on appropriately, so you're seeing, essentially hallucinations. So that's a problem. And then, so this is where we get to this idea about technological resolution that we can't actually see. So in a traumatic brain injury, you can see, I think there's one part, if you have a hematoma, so you have bleeding on the brain, you could visualize that with, if you went into the emergency room, they'd be able to see that on a CT scan or an MRI, they'd see a big lesion there. But oftentimes that doesn't happen when you have a milder injury, so like a concussion. The brain looks normal to anybody who is even a trained neurologist would say that the brain looks normal. But in fact, what's happening is at more of this microstructure level, where these, so I'll use my silly putty here, where these axons are nice and thin and they connect with each other, so they're just little inputs like that, and that's where you have this damage. And as we go along, we'll talk about that, but it's really hard to see that just by going into the emergency room. So again, this is something, I've already shown this, but you can then, hopefully this will help you remember that, but you have the coup, so the direction of the blow. So in this case, she's falling backwards, so she's hitting the back of her skull, so that's where the impact is, so that would be the coup part. And that can that can lead to bleeding on the brain, that can lead to bruising of the brain. But in fact, oftentimes what happens is, so she gets hit on the back, and then her brain bounces forward, and that, in fact, that front part can also cause bleeding in the brain, or hematomas, or hemorrhages, or contusions, so bruising on the brain. And that, so that's one of these things that I always find really difficult about when you see a head injury or brain injury. Let's say if a hockey player is on the ice and he falls and hits his head, they have there's a company that makes impact sensors for helmets now. So they're trying to figure out, how strong of an impact would cause injury to the brain. And so, in fact, the Carleton team, the hockey team, has those impact sensors on their helmets, and I think the 67s. So you get a puck back here, they can measure that impact and say, okay, yes, this led to a concussion. But if an individual falls on the ice, you get that impact there, but then it also has a secondary impact in the front when the brain wiggles around. And that's often where there's more serious damage for whatever reason. So again, these mechanics are not really clearly understood. But what happens, and this is what we'll get to, is it's not only that, so in a milder form, like a concussion, you don't often have the bleeding or any contusions, but what's happening is all the microstructure of the brain is getting twisted around and ripped apart, and so that's what the silly putty will show. And that's where it really becomes difficult to see the actual level of damage and diagnose it. So what is happening? So these are, again, some of the outcomes of a traumatic brain injury, but also a a concussion. So just, again, overall cognitive efficiency. So that's something that neuropsychologists like to throw around. And that's, again, we go back to the idea about the frontal lobes being that executive function. So your ability to, to do mental calculations, to concentrate, it's just sort of put under this umbrella term as, in at least the traumatic brain injury world, as cognitive efficiency. I've been calling it executive function. So again, that frontal part of your brain to be able to say, do this, keep track of this. I have to, as I'm up here lecturing, I have to keep track of what I just said, make sure it all flows, make sure I keep my time going, and all this and that. So it's my frontal lobe that's keeping that on. But so again, you can see that when you have an impact either from the back or the front, that frontal lobe is really getting jarred around and can get damaged. So again, the frontal and the temporal. So the frontal lobe, that executive function, that really important part of the brain that makes us humans, who we are, but also the temporal lobe, so the memory centers of the brain. And this is where what you see in this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or the CTE, from punch-drunk boxers and football players and NFL players that get into a lot of fights. What happens is their temporal lobe starts to get destroyed. Basically, it looks like an Alzheimer's brain, and that can then lead to these personality, social behavior changes, memory loss, everything that's kind of associated with what you'd see in advanced Alzheimer's disease. But some of these fighters, are showing this when they're 50, 40, I think one was even 30. So it's really an advanced pathology that's happening in the brain because of all this damage. So again, this is what I had already mentioned, is that there's not obvious signs or abnormalities in a structural scan. So if you go into a CT, so a computed tomography scanner, or a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, so just something that gives you the structure of the brain, you won't see anything that's wrong with the person who's had, now I'll talk about concussions, a person who's had concussions. So it's a functional disturbance, it's not a structural disturbance as they put it. But again, I think that's also a misnomer, because it's a structural damage, but at this really microstructural level, which then ultimately will affect the functioning of the brain. So we'll slowly get into that as we move along. So recovery, so again, for a more traumatic brain injury, recovery can take 2 to 3 years, cognitive recovery 9 months. In a concussion recovery, for even a hockey player who really takes a hard hit into the boards, recovery is a week to 2 weeks. So most of us will overcome those problems pretty rapidly. Some people don't, and they develop this post-concussion syndrome, which can last up to 3 months, beyond 3 months, and that's when we start to get a bit concerned. But a lot of the recovery does, you can recover that. So that's that brain's ability to compensate, to be plastic, to change, to route around the damage. Memory functions seem to be a bit slower, so the temporal lobe, for whatever reason, is again another, it's a sensitive part of the brain, just like the frontal lobe where your intelligence is taking place. But the temporal lobe, so down here, this seems to be the first place that's affected in Alzheimer's pathology, and that's an important part of forming memories. And as most of us know, memories seem to really slip away pretty quickly, even just with normal aging. So for whatever reason, this memory functions are really sensitive, and then they're slower to recover. So as it says here, the final level of memory performance is lower than for other cognitive functions. So you can, I can be up here, I can keep everything on track online, keep my attention, keep my concentration, but now I can't remember what I had for breakfast or something, which I do remember. I can't remember what I had for supper last night. So what is a concussion? So again, getting away from the more traumatic brain injury, and again, this has to change. So they consider it the mildest form of a traumatic brain injury, which I think, again, is a misnomer, because, obviously a traumatic brain injury, if you have bleeding in the brain, if you have, swelling, you need to go in for an emergency surgery. Concussion, then they say, well, you don't have to go in for surgery because there's no damage. But that's the problem. So, and the other thing is that you have, athletes who say, no, I'm fine. I don't have, nothing's wrong. And I was talking to a physical therapist at Carleton, and she would say, she would go out on the ice with an injured player, and the first thing they say is, I don't have a concussion, and it's like, I didn't ask you that, and so she's, it's got some baggage associated with it. So, but I think in fact a concussion often is a more serious injury because it's undetected. So you can't see it, and then it just keeps going and going, and there's problems with a second injury, a second concussion, and that, so if you have this first concussion, you say, no, I'm fine, even though you're seeing stars, you can't remember what's happening, you don't know where you are, you go back on the ice, you get another hit to the head, and that often can lead to more serious trouble like loss of consciousness, coma, and I mean, in serious cases, there's been incidences of death, so it's not, I think it's not necessarily mild at all, and I think that's going to change with the new DSM-5 that's coming out. So anyways, I've already kind of covered the deformation. And so this, again, you can have a direct blow to the head. So if you think about football players, constantly smashing their heads together, boxers getting hit in the head, that is, clearly going right up into the brain and causing damage. But you can have absence of impact to the head. So again, just a simple, I guess you could run into the wall or something. I guess the important part here to think about is that the brain is going to wobble inside the skull no matter what. So, if you get a direct blow, obviously it's going to move back and forth pretty rapidly. But even if your body suddenly, you're running and you hit the wall but you don't hit your head, the brain is still going to wobble quite a bit. And that can cause this sort of tearing of tissue. So the silly putty can get, twisted around. And in fact, if I could do this properly, it could break. And that could cause, that would be basically evidence of a concussion. So it's just a rapid deceleration of head movement that really is what causes, I guess, the pathology of a concussion. So, and that's, again, I've already kind of talked about this. So the brain, if you have a severe blow, the brain bounces within the cavity, causing blood vessels to tear. So you can have bleeding, when blood accumulates between the brain and the dura, so it can form a clot, so you can have all this, you can have swelling. But also what's happening is as the brain gets this impact, it also moves forward, it shifts around, it twists, and so you can imagine, twisting a muscle where you have those muscle fibers that get broken, or and then it really hurts or you get cramped up. That's essentially what's happening inside the brain, but it's the part of those muscles, the brain muscle, is what makes you who you are, what gives you your personality, what gives you your memory, your ability to see, your ability to talk, move, everything. So when you have damage there, it's a bit, it can be very serious.